Good morning, my friends. I have been specifically asked to make a lecture on this particular aspect of public policy. So here I am. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about substantive disruption and incrementalism, how these tools are used in public policy, and how do institutions have got an effect on the public policy. So, to start with, let me tell you that public policy basically is a crucial aspect of modern society, and understanding how it changes is essential for citizens, for policymakers, and scholars all alike. Now, this particular presentation would provide you an overview of the process of policy change, and as I told you that we'll be focusing on substantial disruption and incrementalism, the role of institutions, and their relationship to the policy change. Now, first of all, let's talk about definition of public policy. Now, public policy is a set of actions or inactions which are taken by the government officials or by the government, could be by the interest groups and by the public to address different social, economic, and political issues. Now, basically, public policy can be categorized into three types, and these three types are substantive policies that address specific issues, so substantive policies. Number two, procedural policies. So, procedural policies are those policies that govern the process of decision making. And number three are redistributive policy. Redistributive policies are those policies that aim to redistribute resources or benefits, like progressive taxation, which would take the burden of taxation from the poor one to the richer one. And the key actors involved in policy making, they include, number one, the topmost is your government or the political parties, the interest groups, which could be various types of like commerce groups or pressure groups, and the public themselves. And each group plays a very crucial role in shaping public processes, depending on how much power or strength they yield on this whole process. Now, let's talk about the concept of substantial disruption. Now, substantial disruption itself, it refers to significant and sudden changes. Remember, policy making is like a spectrum. On one hand, you have got this substantive disruption. On the other hand, you've got incrementalism. So, substantial disruption actually refers to significant and sudden change. So, a massive change in policy. So, what happens is that this is a sort of a massive change in policy that changes the policy landscape. Some of the examples include like revolutions, like just take the example of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, different types of social movements which can shape the policy landscape, and the technological advancements that can also alter the policies. Now, these disruptions can create new opportunities for policy change, and they can challenge the existing power structures. They usually provide a window of opportunity for the policymakers to introduce new policies or reform the existing ones. Now, let's talk about the concept of incrementalism. Now, what is incrementalism? Now, incrementalism refers to gradual, small, incremental, step-like changes in public policy. So, you're not drastically changing as you do it in the substantive disruption, rather you are making small changes. And the examples include like a little bit of policy tweak here and there. Let's say you are changing your energy policy or defense policy and you're making a small adjustment there and there. So, that would be incrementalism. So basically what you're doing, you're making small adjustments and small refinements to your existing policies. Now, incrementalism allows for adaptation to existing policies. So there is not a massive change. So the thing is that you are basically avoiding a sort of a sudden reaction to change in policy. So basically you allow that if there is a change, the people would slowly and gradually adopt to the policy. So adaptation to existing policies, which actually enables the policymakers to respond to the changing circumstances and refine policies over time. So it's a longer process, so you get plenty of time to refine policies over time. So that is incrementalism. Now let's talk about the role of institutions in policy change. We very often heard about this word institutions. So what are institutions? Basically, institutions are established structures. So these could be established structures of command, of authority, of governance. They've got their rules, they've got their regulations, they've got their norms, and as a whole, this established structure can shape policy making. So, like for example, your judiciary is an institution, your parliament is an institution, senate is an institution, army is an institution, Your bureaucracy is an institution. So institutions are established structures. So all your government agencies, legislative bodies, judicial systems, they are example of institutions, and they have got an impact on policymakers because they can either facilitate or even hinder policy change depending on their interests and influences. And like the history is full of like many examples where these institutions have either facilitated or hindered policy change. Now, institutions, they play a crucial role in policy, or in, let's say, in shaping policy change. Now, as I told you, that they can either facilitate or hinder their the policy change depending on whether they've got the whatever interest they've got in that policy and whatever influence they exert on the whole policy process system. For example, judiciary, if they think that something is against the constitution or can sort of create a constitutional crisis, they can strike down the regulation, they can strike down the processes, okay, and they can like sort of legally challenge those things. So depending on what they think about that, so institutions have got a very crucial role. In short, they've got a very crucial role in shaping overall policies. Now, as far as institutions are concerned, the next question are endogenous and exogenous institutions. Now, this is a term which is used in like textbooks of policy making, endogenous and exogenous institutions. Now, institutions can both be endogenous and exogenous, remember, though we do classify them that whether they are endogenous or exogenous. Now, what are endogenous institutions? Now, endogenous institutions are internal to the policy making process, and they have a direct outcome or impact on policy outcomes. Like, for example, government agencies, like for example your parliament, your select committees, your legislative bodies and judicial systems. So they are internal because they have got a direct process, like direct role in the policy making process, either facilitating or hindering. So they can like facilitate it, like sort of put a seal of approval on the legislation, or they can strike down those legislations as well. Exogenous institutions are external to the policy making process, so they do not have a direct role in the policy making process, but they can still influence your policy outcomes. Like for example, you've got different types of interest groups or pressure groups. Media is a very good example. In Pakistan, media, is also considered to be the fourth pillar of the state. So media in the form of electronic media, and these days social media as well, so because it shapes public opinion. And you might have seen the results of the current election in Pakistan, like it has been the thing that it has been shaped by the social media as well. The social media influencers, the social media campaigns and things like that, they have got a massive influence. So these are exogenous institutions which do not have a direct role, but they can still shape the public opinion, they can still shape the policies. So media is a very good example of exogenous institutions. Okay, now coming down to the concept of integrating substantial disruption and incrementalism. We talked that basically these are two different extremes of the spectrum. Substantive disruption, like massive change; incrementalism, small changes. Now, combining these two concepts, remember, sometimes substantial disruption can create opportunities for incremental change, while incrementalism can refine and improve policies. Like for example, the civil rights movements, which was basically a substantive disruption in America, civil rights movements in the 60s, that led to incremental, like first of all, it was a substantive disruption, and over a period of time, then it led to incremental policy changes, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was an incremental change. But before that, the civil rights movements was a substantial disruption. So substantial disruption and incrementalism are not mutually exclusive. We can't say like either this or that. Substantial disruption can create opportunities for incremental change, while incrementalism can refine and improve policies. So as I told you, civil rights movements in the 60s in America was an example of substantial disruption, and then it led to a number of incremental policy change. For example, the American with the Disability Act. Now let me explain this American Civil Rights Acts of 60, I think it was 1964, and it came as a substantial disruption. So basically, this Civil Rights Acts of 1964, you might have heard that in 60s there was a lot of discrimination against the blacks, and they were not allowed on the buses or not allowed in the hotels or something. So then came the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. So that changed the whole landscape. That was an example of substantial disruption. So it led to a sort of a social equality for the blacks, and then it led to incremental policy changes in the coming subsequent years. So the civil rights movements, like including protests, there were boycotts, and there were landmark court decisions that created a window of opportunity for the policymakers of that time to introduce new policies and then reform the existing one. So subsequent policy changes which came after 1964, like the Fair Housing Act and the American with Disability Acts, and these were the acts of incrementalism. So they refined and improved the policies over time. Another example of substantive disruption is the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, again, this is an American example, Affordable Care Act of 2010. Now, this is also very commonly known as the Obamacare plan. Obamacare, you might have heard about that in the newspapers from that era of the 2010. So the American Affordable Care Act, which is also known as the Obama Care Act, is another example of substantial disruption because this totally reforms the healthcare system, the American healthcare system. And before that, there were so millions of Americans which were not covered by the insurance companies because the insurance companies were taking people on their own terms and conditions. So this actually changed the whole landscape. That made it compulsory for the insurance companies to sort of provide coverage, to expanded coverage to millions of Americans. So this was a substantive disruption, and it changed the overall American healthcare landscape. And the insurance companies were forced to provide coverage to millions of people. So after that, subsequent policy changes that did occur to American Care Act, there were certain adjustments to the ACS individual mandate, and it led to expansion of the Medicaid to millions of Americans. They were further like example of incrementalism. So basically, you combined a sort of a substantive disruption followed by small incrementalisms, and that refined and improvised policies over a period of time. So Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act of 2010, is a big example of substantive disruption, and afterwards there were a lot of changes in that as well, done by the American Senate, American Congress, and the American Supreme Court. That are the sort of examples of incrementalism. Now, coming down to the concept of institutional factors in policy change. So, like, what are the institutional factors related to the institution that can shape the change in the policies? Now, I told you, institutions yield power depending on how much power they've got, like judiciary, army, parliament, and they do play a crucial role in shaping policy change. Like government agencies, interest groups, public opinion, they all have a say in the policy making process. Maybe the media has got social media at its side. Interest groups might have got people or political parties which they sort of fund. Government has got its own sort of a legal powers. Similarly, Supreme Court plays a very significant role in shaping public policy through judicial reviews, so they can review the existing things and taking in view the constitutional constraints and taking in view the interest of the public, things like that. Interest groups themselves, they lobby public policymakers to influence policy outcomes, while public opinion, I know, can shape through social media policy, for example, even through elections. So some of the challenges in integrating these two concepts of substantial distribution and incrementalism. Remember, if we try to integrate these two things, substantive disruption and incrementalism, and I've explained that through example that has happened, it can still be challenging due to conflict. I would say, let me put it this way, because there are conflicting interests and conflicting values. Maybe there is political polarization and there are institutional barriers as well. So sometimes it can be a challenge to integrate substantial disruption with incrementalism. So either because of the amount of power that you yield, or because of the amount of opposition that you might have, you might not be able to do substantial disruption. You might have to go for incrementalism, or sometimes you might have the sort of powers where you would just avoid incrementalism and maybe go for substantial disruption, or maybe combine these two. So policymakers can face challenges in reconciling substantive disruption with incrementalism, as the two approaches have conflicting interests and values. Political polarization can also hinder policy change, as policymakers may be less willing to compromise and collaborate. Some of the institutional barriers, such as government agencies and interest groups, can also pose challenge to policy change, and there are numerous examples where you will see that the government agencies, based on the political pressures, like for example the sugar cartels may in Pakistan, can sort of influence the government to avoid sort of a taxation on the agriculture and things like that. So In a nutshell, remember that substantive policy and incrementalism are two different, like, sort of ends of the spectrum of policy making. And though they've got their own conflicting values and interests, sometimes they can be combined together. So remember, substantive disruption is massive changes in policy making. Incrementalism or small changes in policy making. They can be combined, though it can be challenging, and institutions can be either endogenous or exogenous depending on whether they are directly involved in the policy making or whether they exert external influences. And overall policy change is a sort of a complex outcome of all these processes, and sometimes one thing works, sometimes the other thing works. So there are no hard and fast rules in policy making. There are no rights or wrongs. It just depends on the circumstances. So one thing might be right in one circumstance, might not be okay in another circumstance. So I hope, my friend, you have understood the concepts of substantive disruption and incrementalism through this lecture. I hope you've liked it, and if you've liked it, give me a thumbs up. And if you've got any further questions or queries, put it down in the comment section below. I'm more than happy to answer that. Have a very good day. I'm signing off. Bye-bye.